Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by John Leonidou.
Yeah, hi, my name's John Leonidou and I'm the UEFA Correspondent for Cyprus.
Well, thanks very much for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today we are going to be discussing APOP Kinyras FC, a club from Cyprus who went defunct in 2012, so only 12 years or so ago now, but they're a little bit of a microcosm into how football in Cyprus can be, and a really good look at some of the themes we're going to be pulling out of this episode, I think, is probably the best way to put it. I know that sounded a wee bit more complicated than it had to be, but yeah, that's effectively what we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be about APOP Kinyras and football in Cyprus. So John, why don't you start us off from the very beginning and kick things off by telling us a little bit about the backstory of APOP Kinyras?
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a sort of, that sort of old saying about, how these sort of football clubs just sort of come out of nowhere, really, and sort of win everything and sort of, take everything by storm. The club was founded in 2003 and dissolved in 2012. During that time, they managed to storm up the leagues into the first division. They achieved what no other team in their district ever achieved, or county is probably better known here. They achieved something which is unprecedented in that they managed to win a trophy, which was in 2009. It's a bit of a strange one. You have to sort of understand how APOP Kinyras sort of rose from basically obscurity into what they were. Is obviously it's the finances are involved. Now, Paphos at the time was and continues to be a very sort of resurgent area where a lot of land is being bought. It's a very beautiful area. There's a lot of investment from Russia, from China, from the UK. So there was obviously a lot of money there. And the chairman at the time, who was obviously involved heavily with development, with land development, he had this vision for a club. In order to do that, there needed to be a merger between two sort of village teams that were basically in the second division, a team called Embas and a team called Beyas. They merged together to make APOP Kinyras Beyas. And that's essentially what happened. They had the money. They used it. They got to the top division. They bought some very good players. They were spending above their means, though, and eventually that came back to haunt them because as financial fair play kicked in, they were in trouble.
Yeah, it's quite a common theme, and isn't it, when these clubs are kind of formed and there's a lot of financial backing that they kind of spend beyond their means.
Yeah, it was a strange. I mean, it was one of those times in Cyprus where there was suddenly there was a lot of money in the Cypriot league. And there was the television rights. The money that was being put into there was huge. There was a lot of sponsors. There was a bank they went bust as well. A bank called Marfin Popular Bank, one of the biggest banks in Cyprus. They were the sponsors of the league. They went bankrupt. So there was a lot of money being pumped in, and a lot of that money, obviously, in my opinion, didn't go into youth development. It went into the salaries of very, very prominent players. Because it was during this time that Cyprus enjoyed its most prosperous times in Europe. I don't know if you remember, but there was a Cypriot team in the quarterfinals of the Champions League. There were very big players coming to Cyprus, and APOP Kinyras did sign some very, very big players themselves. They weren't a team made up of local players from that area. They had players in there. They had a Polish international playing up front. They had players from Argentina. They had players from Spain. There was a lot of heavy investment. And the fan base of that team was barely 1,000. So, it was money talks, as they say. Yeah, that was the backbone of that team. It was heavily financed. They were spending above their means, and it did come back to haunt them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it. I mean, whenever someone says to me, if a team has a fan base of 1,000 and they're spending big money and they're bringing all these players over, sometimes it can be a little bit of a red flag. But outside of that, it does sound like they had a good spread of players. I mean, was that common for teams in Cyprus at the time to maybe have the odd international? Were they, kind of keeping up with a trend there, or were they the outliers in how they were doing that?
Well, it started off initially with in the 80s and late 80s, 90s. They started off with a 3 foreign player rule. So what would happen is they would have 3 foreign players. Usually they were a lot of players from the former Yugoslavia came to Cyprus. Close relations between Serbia and Cyprus, both being Orthodox. They've always had close relations with Greece. So there were a lot of players from Serbia. Then they expanded it to 6 foreign players around the sort of mid-90s. And then after entering the EU, we became unlimited. So it was an unlimited number of players. There was a team I remember that I used to go fondly watch with my two boys. And they were a team in which they used to get about 30 to 60 fans a game in the first division. And they didn't have one Cypriot player in the starting 11. So, yeah, and it's very, very common to get players from Argentina, players from Spain, Portugal especially. It's a huge hunting ground for players. They're affordable as well, because you have to think also they're offering good salaries, but they're offering good salaries to players in Portugal that are good players, but they're never really going to earn much more. They're not going to move to Benfica. They're not going to go to Sporting Lisbon, and they're certainly not going to go to to a better league. So they think, well, why not? If I'm 27, 28, 29 years old and I'm not really going to go anywhere, I might as well go to Cyprus and, at least I can get a chance to play some European football.
Yeah, you're right from what you said earlier on. Everyone was doing it. Loads of clubs were at it and involved in this period of insane spending, if you want to put it that way. And it's probably one of the reasons why Cyprus has so many lost football clubs, because during this period, so many clubs spent so well beyond their means, overshooting the runway type stuff, do you know what I mean? And they ended up in serious debt because of it. And, that's something we'll come back to touch on later, because there's some interesting dynamics in there with fan culture in Cyprus. But would you agree with me that the amount of clubs were spending was a massive contributing factor to why there's so many defunct clubs in Cyprus now?
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah, with a population of just over 1 million. It's a tiny country, really. And one third of it is obviously under Turkish occupation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is a strange one. Yeah, football's a huge thing there, obviously. Like most countries, football is a huge sport, but they don't plan for the long term. They don't. It is a big problem. Something I've always been I've been extremely critical of Cypriot football, is that they always plan for the season. They never plan ahead. And especially when it comes to things like, when it comes to the smaller teams, you can understand maybe with the top 3 or top 4 teams desperate to win a trophy every season, desperate to get into Europe, to get into the Europa League group stages, or even the big one, Champions League group stages. It's the financial rewards that come from it. So they're all falling over themselves trying to get into these, into Europe, and obviously win trophies to appease their fans. But what I find a bit sort of striking is that we see the sort of bottom teams and the middle teams all doing the same. Sort of just spending a lot of time, whatever cash they do get into the club goes on bringing in players. There's no proper foundations put in place for grassroots. They say they do. I'm very critical of them in the fact that I don't believe they do enough. If you look at countries like Latvia and Iceland and even Malta, they put down some pretty decent foundations. Faroe Islands, they put down some good foundations for their young players to produce produce players and to produce national teams. They don't do that in Cyprus. Our national team was absolutely, for me, the national team is very, very poor quality players, poor organisation. There needs to be far more done, with the investment. And so, yeah, like I said before, like I mentioned to you before, they don't plan for the long term. Everything's for the short term, and everything's about that season.
We'll come back onto that in a bit. Just to go back to Kinyras just for a minute.
Yeah.
Once they were formed and once the spending began, did that translate to immediate success? Is that the reason that they shot up the league so quickly, is because they were outspending the other teams that were around them in their divisions, and therefore they were just able to shoot past them with ease?
Yeah, they started in the third division, for what I remember, in 2003. Those two teams, Mbas and Beas, they weren't powerhouses in those divisions, but they were one of the stronger teams. They weren't completely obscure. So when they merged, and with that extra investment, they just went up. They literally went up the leagues, and they went into the first division. I think their first season in the first division wasn't great. I think they got relegated, because I think it was too much of a jump for them back. And they finished. I think they finished mid-table, from what I remember. I think the following season, I think they won the cup, which was a bit of a shock, really. They were a good side. They knocked out some decent teams in that cup run. But yeah, they, like you say, they were, they started in the third division, and they just ran their way up. It was fairly easy for them, I think, to sort of get promoted, and they did have that financial backing, and they were buying the best players to move up. And as soon as they got into the first division, they went and signed a whole cluster of South American players. They had a Belgian player who later got Cypriot nationality. They had a good Polish international who was playing for Panathinaikos. Don't know if you remember him, Alisa Debe. He was born to Nigerian parents, but he was a Polish international, and he was playing for them. You know, they had some decent players, and it was quite striking, really. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. But just to go back to the cup run, they took some pretty big scalps in that run as well, didn't they? I think it was AEK Larnaca, then Apoel in the semi-final, I think, and then Isle Limassol in the final. And one thing that I wanted to ask you was, you know, how did Cyprus react to this cup win, John? How did Cypriot football react to it? Because I'm quite curious. Did people think it was a bit unfair? You know, obviously because they were spending so much money, or was APOP just one club in a long line of shock cup wins? For example, you know, if everyone's doing it, they are, then we could too, sort of mentality.
Yeah, the latter. Everyone was doing it. I mean, APOP were not the only team spending. They all were, and they still are, most of them. No, it was a fact that they were they managed to get the wins over Ammonia. They beat Apoel. The win over IL was a shock. Everyone was expecting IL to win that final, even though APOP did beat Apoel and Ammonia. And they, to be honest with you, I thought IL were the better team in the final. APOP essentially beat them with 2 counter-attacks in that game. It was I was at the game, I remember, and they really were hanging on for dear life in that game. And I think IL just ran out of steam, and then APOP basically, like I said, just hit them on the counter, literally hit them on the counter with 2 goals and knocked the stuffing out of them.
Yeah, their goals came in the 84th and the 88th minute, I think, so very, very late on in the game. I can imagine it was pretty heartbreaking for the Isle Limassol fans. And obviously, though, that means they also got to strut their stuff in Europe, but it was only for a round, sadly, as they ended up getting drawn against Rapid Vienna, which is a bit unlucky. Obviously, Austrian heavyweights and a team with significantly more European experience than APOP.
They were unlucky in that game. I was at both. Not both. I was at the game in Cyprus. I'd watched the game in Austria. And I'm not just saying this because obviously I'm Cypriot, but they honestly didn't deserve to go out in that. They were unlucky because they got a very tough team early on in the third qualifying round. Rapid Vienna were half a decent side, but they were unlucky. They were very unlucky in that game. Rapid Vienna got a very, very lucky goal in an extra time to knock them out. But yeah, it was one of those things. I think if they had a slightly better draw, I think they would have gone on to have a decent run. I think, honestly, I would do.
Well, that's the thing, because you can already see that they're kind of getting the spotlight put on them a lot. I mean, that looking at it, that is an insane cup run that they went on. I mean, they took some huge scalps in that run, and then obviously they finally get the pass into Europe, and in a lot of ways, you know, obviously the club is backed financially. You almost, because you know that they're still a kind of underdog team, and they went and won this cup, be backing them to be Vienne. So it's kind of reassuring hearing you say that they didn't deserve to go out in that. They actually gave a good account of themselves.
Yeah, they were very good in that game. I actually felt sorry for them, so I thought they were actually really. I was thinking, you know, wow, you know, and the weird thing is, I think after that game, from what I remember, the wheels came off. Yeah. Everything sort of just started to go a little bit downhill for them from there, and then it really went downhill afterwards. But it was, that game was they were desperately unlucky for me. I thought Rapid Vienna were very, very, very lucky to have gone through on that night. It was one of those games where you think, wow, how did they not go through? They absolutely blasted them in that game. They were unlucky to go 1-0 down. They came back, were winning 2-1. They missed a cluster of chances to go 3 and 4-1 up. And yeah, it's one of those things. Probably just an experience, really, isn't it? It's that sort of. I mean, that's what Apoel and Apollon and Ammonia they have over. They had over APOP. Is that they have that experience in Europe. They know how to sort of navigate certain games.
Well, I mean, as you said there, and this is quite common, and it's something, a common theme that we found is that these clubs will go on some kind of cup run, they'll get a wee shot at Europe, and then the wheels start to come off.
Yeah.
I mean, what actually happened to them? Was it just the case that they overspent and they were spending too much? Well,
basically, I mean, what happened was the club was spending above its means, and it was doing it for a very, very long time. It's just bad management, and it happened to quite a lot of clubs as well. The bigger clubs were essentially doing the same. Around the same time, there was a big scandal with Ammonia that recently played Man United in the Europa League. But they had such a huge fan base that they were basically almost bailed out by their own fans.
Okay.
So there wasn't enough. There was no one there to sort of rescue APOP or rescue Alki, the other team that also had went into liquidation. So it was just bad management, loans upon loans. And they just didn't have the money to be able to bail them out. when the Cyprus FA and UEFA came in with their financial fair play rules, they were sort of caught with their pants down, and they just couldn't balance the books, and then they were relegated to the second division as punishment, and they just never recovered. There was so much, they owed so much money that they just had to declare bankruptcy, and that's what happened in 2012. They literally just turned around and said, "Right, we can't pay this off," and that was it. That was the end of the fairy tale.
Exactly, and there was in terms of the money situation wasn't good, and they did end up having to be declared bankrupt.
There was some controversy around. There was some sort of scandal about the way they managed the club and the way they secured certain loans, and the board members started turning on each other and sort of accusing each other. So it was never really 100% clear who was to blame. Personally, I think it was all of them. It was a combination of a lot of things, and I think they all had their sort of snouts in the trough, didn't they? With this, with this club, so it was bad management. They knew what they were doing. It was for them a vehicle of to sort of get themselves, into a situation where they could win a cup, they could maybe get into Europe, and they were just banking on that. It was a hell of a gamble, and it backfired for them in the end. What really shook them and shook a lot of teams was financial fair play, and how the Cyprus FA really, really seriously imposed it, because they knew the money situation was getting out of control with the clubs. They were overspending. It just wasn't viable. It wasn't financially viable for the way these clubs to operate in the way they did. They needed to operate within their means. And when they were told to get in line and bring their books in order, some of the clubs scraped through and just about managed to survive. Others didn't. And APOP were one of those teams.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of saw it with CF Race too. Not overly comparable, but at the end of the day, APOP were a smaller club with arguably less history than some of the other larger clubs in the league in Cyprus. And I mean, if this happened to an Omonia or an Apoel, do you think the same thing would have happened, or are APOP and clubs of that size simply more expendable than the larger clubs in the league?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. You've got to look at the fan base as well. There'll have been uproar if one of these teams, and also for the Cypriot game as well. I mean, the CFA know that these clubs are big, and they can't really afford to lose them. They are the big teams on the island, and the last thing they'd want is to lose one of these big teams. I wouldn't think so much that they would neglected Paphos. I mean, if somebody really wanted to save Paphos, if someone was really ambitious and wanted to come in and say they could have, but there just wasn't any interest. And the reason there really wasn't any interest is because they're such a small team. They are a small team. I mean, the big team in Paphos is, as you probably know now, is Paphos FC, and Beja are a village. They're basically a little village outside of Paphos. It just wasn't enough support, even during the cup final. I mean, the stadium was 3/4 full of IL fans, and just the one section of Beja fans, and even that wasn't full. So you can imagine it was a historic game, a cup final, and their stand wasn't even full. Well, I wouldn't say there wasn't enough interest, but there wasn't obviously enough backing around them to step in and bail them. That wasn't the case with Ammonia, and that wasn't the case with it never really happened to IL. IL sort of bailed themselves out. With Ammonia, it was a very, very close shave.
It's very reminiscent of what happened to Gretna. This huge investor came in, gave them loads of money. They spent well beyond their means, absolutely rocketed up the leagues, got themselves to a cup final. It was strange because Gretna, at the time, you're talking a village with a population of maybe 10,000 at a push. You had people who bought tickets as Gretna fans and bought jerseys and bought flags and whatever else, and went to support Gretna, even though they weren't fans of it because they liked the underdog story. But obviously after that, the rug got pulled and the wheels fell off. But as you've said before, if everyone in Cyprus was doing it, then maybe this team just got a bit more success than the others. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, they definitely. They won a trophy. I mean, they'll always have that. They'll always look back and think, well, at least we won a trophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they weren't the only club, and we can't really say they were the only culprits. Yeah, obviously they splashed a lot of money, but I remember some other teams out there splashed a lot of money as well. A lot of times it would be chairmen putting some of their own money in it, businessmen that own the clubs, and obviously, especially you have to understand as well. I mean, it's a bit of an ego trip running a football club in Cyprus as well. I mean, the press officer for Cypriot clubs are always on television. Talk before the game, they talk after the game. The chairman talk all the time as well. So there's interviews after the game, always with the chairman, always with the vice chairman, always with the press officer. So it's a bit of an ego trip for them as well. Yeah. This sort of prestige of being able to say, oh, I have a football club and I run this and I won this and I won that. And they're all at it. I mean, as soon as they had a bit of money, they all sort of try to splash into the team. Olympiakos, Nicosia as well. they were just as bad as anyone else, basically, in terms of the way they went about spending. They bought a German international at one point as well. They had a German international playing with them, and they only used to get about 700-800 fans a game. So it was just nuts. I don't know if you remember him, Paulo Rink. He only played about 4 games for Germany, but he was still
the name rings a bell. Yeah,
he was Brazilian German. He played for them for 2 seasons, which was extraordinary. And it was they all did it. They all basically were spending well above their means. I mean, it was almost insane, really, to sort of go to football matches and just see these German internationals and Slovakian internationals and sort of Senegalese internationals and only see about 2 or 3 Cypriot players on the pitch.
I mean, that actually kind of nicely leads on to the discussion that we're going to have shortly. But just before we go into that, do you ever think anyone will try to bring APOP back?
I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest with you. There's been a Russian businessman has taken over Paphos FC and obviously invested heavily. Explains why they're at the top, sort of battling for the title and battling for trophies. I wouldn't be surprised if Paphos were to win the league or were to win a major trophy, that someone might come along and say, "Oh, hello, maybe it might is a time for us to sort of get a few teams and sort of give them a bit of a run for their money. Maybe have 2 big teams from challenging, like we have in Limassol, like we have in Larnaca, and like we have in Nicosia." So I would not be surprised at all. What kind of team that would be? It will probably be in the same vein as APOP Kinyras FC. I would not be surprised if they came back. There's currently a team called Beas 2014 that play in the 3rd or 4th division. They use the stadium that APOP Kinyras was using. Surprised if somebody just came along, bought them out, and said, "Right, okay, here we go." And then in 2 or 3 seasons, they're in the top division. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. The foundations are there. Paphos is a beautiful place. I wouldn't be surprised at all that if it would not be too much of a difficult choice for footballers 29, 30, 31 years old, kicking on a bit, but not too old, to want to sort of bring their families out there. It's a beautiful place. It's close to the airport. It's a very, very nice life. It's safe. The crime rate there is very low. It really is a beautiful place. So I would not be surprised at all. Yeah, so some investment would be needed, similar to what's happening at Paphos FC, but I wouldn't be surprised at all.
I'm a Celtic fan, and one of the things that I watched closely last year was Neil Lennon's spell at Omonia Nicosia. There's a bit of a perception that players just go there to end their careers, and there's a bit of a negative connotation to it.
You've got 2 different situations here, basically. You've got the sort of player who was a star, maybe in Greece, maybe played in Germany, maybe played in the Premier League maybe 5 years ago, like say 32, 33, maybe 31 years old. Not quite the player he was, but would come to Cyprus for 2 years, elevate the stature of the club. It would galvanize the fans that all want to see him. And maybe he's got still a bit left in his locker. But then you've got the other side to it. You've got the Portuguese player who might be 24, 25, a good, decent player for a mid-table team in Portugal. He's never going to make it at Benfica. He's never going to make it at Sporting, which essentially means he's never going to make it to the Premier League or the Bundesliga or La Liga. So what do? They think, well, I can either stay here and get paid less for playing in Portugal and basically, just have a decent career as a professional, or I can take my family to Cyprus. We can live in a nice place. I'll be playing for one of the top clubs. I'll have a chance to have a crack at the Europa League, which is something I'll probably never get to do, playing for a second division team in Portugal or for a team that's mid-table in Portugal. And that's essentially what happened. I mean, the biggest example for me of this was a player called Paulo Jorge, who helped Apoel get to the quarterfinals of the Champions League. This guy was playing in Portugal. He was, for me, a very, very, very good player, 28, 29-year-old centre-back. And he just wasn't quite good enough to play in the top teams in Portugal. But he played for Apoel in the Champions League, and he was brilliant. Mm-hmm. So you can get situations like that. So you can get players from Portugal or Spain, the second division in Spain, that would think, look, you know what, for my career, maybe it is worth me going out there. Because if I do play well for a Cypriot team and I do get noticed and I am in Europe, I could go to Poland. I could go to France. I could go to, to Scotland. All right. So there is that sort of perception, because they do get sort of lost there playing in believe it or not. They do actually get, because they're not playing in Europe, they don't get noticed as much. Mm-hmm. So we have seen a lot of players from Spain and Portugal and South America that have essentially come from smaller clubs there and then moved on to bigger clubs because they had that stepping stone in Cyprus. So you've got these two sort of levels here. Saying that, if it doesn't work out for them, they disappear into obscurity completely.
Yeah, that's the catch-22 of it, and it's there's this perception that as they slip into obscurity, and that's the kind of sign that their career's over. But it can be very useful for clubs, and it's a very good way to get some talent and a good player onto the side. But
it was quite interesting though, because Cyprus as a national team seemed to be on the rise for quite a while. They claimed big scalps in international fixtures like Ireland, and I think actually a few players from the League of Ireland ended up moving over to Cyprus. Jack Byrne, I think he played for Shamrock Rovers. Not sure if he did before he moved over to Cyprus, but he went to Nicosia. So there was a wee bit of a connection between Cyprus and Ireland now for a wee bit. I don't know if that's still the same though.
It's not a case of if someone arrives from Greece, playing from Greece that played for PAOK or played for Panathinaikos, they'll be basically falling themselves over for him because they know who he is. Yeah, there was they knew that he was a good player, and there was that kind of okay, yeah, let's see what you got kind of thing, straight away. There was also so with him it was, and I always find that it's more difficult from players from Ireland and England, especially since the 90s, for them to do well. I don't know why, but they never seem to do as well when they go to Cyprus. I don't know if it's maybe because of the mentality. It's very much a kind of different. It's not as. I wouldn't say not as professional, but they're sort of used to a different lifestyle. Yeah,
well, it can be a bit of a culture shock for people as well, I suppose. There's always that talk if it's a young player or something like that, then it can take a while for them to settle. You're taking them away from their families and all that kind of a thing. They might feel a wee bit alone, but when it's players coming over with their families, it's a bit of a different dynamic. But I do agree with you as well that it can be a big culture shock for them, and at the end of the day, it can still take people a bit of time to settle. Especially if they're coming over and they're playing football in somewhere where the culture and the lifestyle and the mindset is maybe a little bit different as well. I think Killian Sheridan went over quite recently as well, certainly not too long ago. Got quite a lot of time for him as a player and as a person. I think he's a cracking guy, quite funny, got a bit of a character as well, I think I'm right in saying he enjoyed quite a decent spell in Cyprus as well.
He did, yeah. He was the exception, if I have to be completely honest. Out of all the Irish and British players that were in Cyprus, yeah, he was the exception, and they did like him. Yeah, he was a fan. He was a bit of a hit with they liked him, the fans. I don't think he scored as many goals as he could have, but I think that was also his role as well. He was always just a little bit. He wasn't. Yes, he was a number 9, but a lot of times the two wingers would basically play in front of him. He would sort of come back a bit and collect the ball. I thought he was a good finisher. I thought he was a pretty decent player.
Was that a big shock when he moved over to Nicosia then?
It wasn't really that much of a shock because I think APOP had released him, and then he decided that Omonia came along with a contract and he took it because he loved living in Cyprus. He was I knew the guy a little bit. I'd interviewed him a few times with UEFA, so I got to know him a little bit. He was a very, very quiet guy. He loved living in Cyprus. His whole life basically was just going to the gym, playing football, and watching Father. That was him, just through and through. He was. And I used to say to him, do you ever sort of want to go back to Scotland, or do you go back to, because he was obviously playing in Scotland before he went there. Or do you ever want to sort of go back to the UK because he was friends, I think, with Jody. I think was he friends with Jody Morris? Yeah, and he said, "No, I love it here." He goes, "I'm not going anywhere." I go, "Really?" He goes, "No, no, like it here. I've got my house, got my swimming pool." His girlfriend, I think she was was she living with him or was she sort of flying out there? I can't remember. But anyway, he was his family would go out there, and he was loving life over there. He absolutely loved it. And he goes, and I've had the chance to play against some of the top teams like Barcelona at the Nou Camp. Things I never would have done. There.
I feel really bad for him because he was obviously loving it in Cyprus, and it's an absolutely beautiful country, and he's ended up in Dundee.
A culture shock there. No, he did love living there. I said to him, "What about coming up? Would you ever sort of come over here like afterwards to coach?" He goes, "Yeah, if I had the chance, I would." Yeah, he loved it there. He absolutely loved Cyprus.
One of the things I actually wanted to ask you, John, you kind of touched on it earlier on. Now, obviously, Cyprus has a bit of a divided history in terms of the different nations that have been involved in it. Obviously, you've got part of the island which is Turkish. You've got part of the island which is Greek. I just wanted to ask what kind of impact and what kind of role has the different nationalities, the divisions, the different politics in the island? What kind of influence has that had on Cypriot football?
It's basically galvanised them.
Okay.
It galvanised them because after the Turkish invasion of 74, some of these football clubs that have been in the northern side of the island were forced to relocate, and they're still known as refugee clubs. And one of those clubs is Anorthosis, who were coached by Getspire, And Anorthosis obviously went into the Champions League group stages for the first time in 2008, and there was a whole massive thing about them being a refugee club and all that stuff, and they played a Turkish team as well in the qualifiers. And so it did galvanize them. It's galvanized the fans as well, especially the Anorthosis, of fans like from Salamina as well. They've all relocated to Larnaca. Ethnikos Achanas, another team that was in the north, and they've relocated as a refugee club. And obviously Apoel, which are politically right wing. And there's obviously a strong sort of Greek Cypriot sort of identity about them, much stronger than there is of Ammonia. So there's that sort of coming into play, and it did galvanize them a lot. I mean, especially most of these teams, AEK Larnaca the same as well. Politics does play a huge role in football in Cyprus. It does. It's like I say, you've got a left wing team and you've got a right wing team, and you don't really have anything in between, really. Every sort of club that was founded in Cyprus has some kind of political affiliation, which for me, I don't think actually think it's a good thing. I hate the fact that politics mixed with football.
No, yeah, I do understand that. And I suppose a lot of people use football to get away from politics in the day to day, which is totally fine, I'm kind of the complete opposite. I think it can be a bad thing in some cases, if governments are using football as a political tool, particularly, authoritarian regimes or whatever. So I think it can be a bad thing, but I think ultimately it's something that can also be a good thing as well. And at the end of the day, it's just kind of reality that the two mix, I think you've got the balance right there, John. You don't think it's a good thing and it shouldn't mix, but you recognise it as being a reality, particularly within the context of Cyprus, and you're quite happy to talk about it, which is great as well, because there's a lot of people out there who just refuse to accept politics as being a part of football, which to me is just nonsense. It's not being realistic. But moving away from that, there's been a huge variety of clubs in Cyprus to have gone defunct, around 50 or more, I think. Something around that mark, maybe 55. Do the conditions still exist in Cyprus where that will continue? Are the same trends there that will see us lose more Cypriot clubs in the near future?
Well, because a lot of sometimes these clubs, they start out almost as pet projects. You get an ambitious chairman come in, he promises all these things, invests all this money, and then decides to leave if he doesn't think it's worth it in the end. And then the club is sort of just left stranded. It has happened a few times. We have had situations where it all depends on who's backing the club. Can I see this fashion changing? Not really, to be honest with you. I think it's the ego trip. I think a lot of these businessmen, they love being on TV. I think they love the fact that they get involved in, for them, it's like a big vehicle for their image, a big vehicle for who they are, to be able to say that, I own this club, or I work at this club, or it's having that sort of that image, isn't it? It's all about their, and I do but strongly believe that. And I've got friends that work in football in Cyprus, but I am still quite critical as well, because I just don't want to have to always watch a football game and then listen to the chairman and the press officer speaking for 30-40 minutes about why it was a penalty or why it wasn't a penalty. Yeah. So it's situations like that. Can I see things changing? Not really. I haven't seen change since I was a little boy, basically. I don't really expect to see any sort of major changes. It'll always be about the big clubs, and it'll always be about the only thing I would probably say that's changed a bit is the emergence of Paphos FC and Aris FC, but that's because of the investment that's been put into these teams. Now, if someone else comes along and just like we discussed before, decides that he wants to buy a small club in Paphos and make them into a major force, well, if he's got the money, then why not?
Yeah, I mean, there's been loads of clubs from Paphos who've gone defunct, and some of them are even linked to earlier clubs who've came and gone there. So it probably wouldn't be too difficult for people to do that if they wanted to, because there's a bit of a theme of clubs churning, almost, to use a kind of gaudy retail term. But that's kind of the case, though, isn't it? I mean, these clubs just kind of come and go in a constant cycle.
Yeah, I mean, that's been regurgitated. I mean, look, it started initially, I mean, this was during the very early 90s and 80s. There were two teams in Paphos called APOP and Evans. These two teams in the 90s, I think it was late 90s or mid 90s, they merged to create AEP. AEP later went bust. And then you had, you had basically a team called Paphos that was in the lower division. And then you saw the emergence of APOP Kinyras FC. APOP Kinyras FC was, of course, a merger of APOP Kinyras and Kinyras FC. These two teams, they merged. It's the same sort of cluster of teams, because there wasn't necessarily a fan of APOP and a fan of Evagoras, and now they've disappeared. The fans of Evagoras and APOP ended up supporting AEP, and the fans of AEP are the ones supporting Paphos FC today. I remember AEP, the fans still referred to them as Paphos. It was always like that. The fans have never really sort of went away. It was always the Paphos FC is essentially the same fans from the late 80s.
Does the constant founding and folding and then regurgitation of all these teams create animosity amongst fan bases, or are there large groups of fans who are just waiting for the next iteration of their club to come along so that they can go back to supporting? And who do they support in the interim?
Yes. I think that's probably exactly it. I think oh well, it doesn't matter. We'll go into liquidation and we'll come back as another name. We'll be the same club. It'll still be the same clubhouse, and it'll still be the same stadium, and it'll still be the same people turning up at the games. So, you've got that situation. I mean, I think the biggest, another example is a team called Alki. Alki were a team that was quite a big side during the 70s, during the 60s. They were a team from Larnaca. They were playing more or less in the shadows of the two other teams, the big teams in Larnaca. But they were still there and thereabouts. They were the runners-up in the cup and stuff like that. And then they merged with another team called Oroklini. And they became Alki Oroklini. Now, the same fans of Alki, they were still the fans of Alki, even though they merged with this other team. For them, nothing had changed, just to change of the name. Even their kits didn't change, but the team had merged. Yeah. And then they didn't merge, but then they split up with them, and they became Alki again. And it's just an ongoing sort of roller coaster. It's just a case of the team sort of changes hands, and it's not so much of a shock for them, especially for the smaller clubs, because it does happen quite a bit. And they do it for one very simple reason, so they can have enough money to compete.
Yeah, that's just something that I was quite curious about. Quite interesting hearing about that. It almost seems like a different. I don't know if it's maybe because they've just gotten used to it, or if it's just because it's always been common. But it seems like that's something that's almost become ingrained within the football and culture of people on the island. To just maybe within the smaller clubs anyway, one, expect it, and two, be ready for the second coming.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's essentially it. I mean, it really is. It's a case of it always is a case of who's gonna back them. And if any of these any of these smaller clubs, they have one or two decent players, they move. They're not going to stay there.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, Alki were quite a big club as well. I mean, they played in the UEFA Cup, they came runners in the Cypriot Cup a number of times. And then dissolved in 2014, so they actually managed to outlive APOP Kinyras, which is kind of weird in a strange way. Although they actually had a bit of history and they had a bit of longevity behind them. But then they kind of get taken up in another mantle, so to speak. So a lot of these clubs do actually have stories of success that they can point to, but I don't know. It's weird. I'm kind of struggling to describe it, but it's like, one club exists, they have all this history, then they go defunct, then a new one gets created, and the fans just sort of jump onto them, but they're not really bothered if they go again. It's such an interesting but strange dynamic, I feel.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. We're having a discussion now. You mentioned now about the success of Alki in the 60s, but they just don't look at that past. The chairman coming in is not going to look back and think, well, we're not. It's not like Newcastle United, where they're going to look back and say, we were that team, or Aston Villa going to look back and say, we were that team. We need to sort of keep that legacy alive. For them, it's always about the season. It's about how much we're going to get, who we're going to sign, how much money can we make out of this season and stay up. And it's just literally looking ahead to that one season. And I think there's very few. I'll be really interested to sort of go out and find some hardcore Alki fans. And if I were to meet them, I think they'd probably be in their 70s or 80s. If I have to be completely honest. People that remember this game, remember that game. My dad played for APOL for 10 years. And he might sort of look back and sort of tell me this team was really good back in the day and so forth. But the younger generation, I mean, it just isn't there. There's not enough support, really. There's not enough of that sort of tradition, like you say, of we were cup, we went to the cup finals, we went to 4 cup finals. You just don't see that. You just don't. There's no sort of talk of that at all. As far as anyone knows, the biggest clubs in Cyprus are APOL, Ammonia, Apollon, IL, and Orthosis, and that's it really. I mean, they're the ones that the history that everyone talks about. They're the ones that turn around and say, "I've won 28 league titles. I was the first team, and I was the first Cypriot team in the group stages of the Champions League. I was the Cypriot team that got to the quarterfinals of the Champions League." Nobody would, for example, hark back and look at teams like APOP and Alki because they're just too small. They're very, very small clubs. Be really interested in these clubs, probably apart from us talking about it right now. Basically, the die-hard fans of these clubs, and unfortunately, they're probably few and far between. Unfortunately, not many of them are probably with us anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say. It sounds like there's almost this kind of cycle of apathy that's being created maybe amongst the younger generation, outside of the clubs that you mentioned, who have a very clear, very distinct and very rich history and a very successful history as well. For the other clubs that have maybe had some history but then folded and reformed, if that's what younger fans are basically being told to expect, then they probably won't want to bother. They would probably stick with a club who is going to be successful, where they can have a lot of good times, create good memories, which is a bit of a shame, really.
It is a shame. Yeah, I would like. I mean, to be honest, I've lived in England now. I go back to Cyprus a lot, but I've moved back to England recently, and we have a team, obviously a local team in my area called Ashford United, and the whole Ashford United are just obviously a very lower league team here, but everyone gets behind them. Everyone in the town goes, "We're going to go watch Ashford," and it's on social media. We have to go see Ashford play, and there's people sort of get behind the team. It doesn't happen really in Cyprus with the clubs there. I mean, when you go and watch a lower league team, it's always just the members of it's the parents of the players that are there, and maybe they'll as well. You won't really see sort of fans there, especially with the smaller teams. Like we're talking second division now. I'm not talking third or fourth division. I'm talking second division teams in Cyprus, with the exception of about 4 or 5 teams. I mean, there's just not enough fans. There's not really enough interest. Most of the younger generation are supporting the big guns. They're supporting Apoel, Ammonia, Apollon, IL. They go out and they watch these teams, and they might have some affiliation. They might have friends that play for these teams. They might go and watch them and give them a bit of support. But there's no fan base really, not a proper fan base.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the thing about this episode, is that there's so many themes that we can pull out here from the story of APOP and the other clubs in Cyprus too, and just a general discussion we've had on football in Cyprus. As I said at the beginning of the episode, it's also a good insight into why there's so many lost football clubs from Cyprus, and I suppose one of the takeaway points from this episode, for me anyway, is that many of them are actually just reiterations or rebirths of one another, but for all the really wrong reasons. And when you're talking there about fan base, it seems to me, and I don't want this to sound disparaging because it's not true. We've all seen what the ultras groups and the diehard fans for like Ammonia and Limassol, as we've said, are capable of doing. Their support is absolutely phenomenal, and you can see that in the displays that they put out there and the ways that they back their team. But for smaller clubs, it just doesn't really seem like they have much of a heart or a soul or a tradition of being followed, which is a massive shame. But I mean, again, it happens in every league where there are bigger teams than you, I suppose. But yeah, it is just still a bit of a shame. And as I said, some of it just seems like for the completely wrong reasons,
It's that sort of fairy tale. You spoke about the fairy tale success of APOP Kinyras. Well, not many people just don't talk about it anymore. Do you know what I mean? It was basically almost seen as like a one-hit wonder, and it was it will never be in the same vein as talking about the big teams of Apoel in the quarterfinals of the Champions League, or Apollon making it to the Europa League, and some of their big wins, like the win over Trabzonspor when Anorthosis, the Cypriot refugees team, they beat the team from Turkey. That was huge. That just sent ripples across the island. These are the things that they sort of look at. It is about the success of these big clubs, which is a bit unfortunate. Really. It wasn't always like that. In the 70s and 60s, there was that sort of there was more support like for the so-called smaller clubs, but from the 90s onwards, I mean, it's completely faded. It is now, unfortunately, just about the top 4, 5, maybe 6 teams. The only thing I would say is the paradox. One of the things I always talk about with Cyprus is the paradox. They put so many, Cyprus's national team now is probably on the same level as, I think they should be on the same level as Iceland and Finland and, maybe some of these countries. But for me, I mean, they've dropped so far down as a national team. and yet their clubs keep putting teams into Europe. Ireland and Scotland have, very often put teams into major tournaments, international tournaments.
Yep.
Cyprus has not even gone close. But then Cyprus has put a club in the quarterfinals of the Champions League, and Ireland's never done that. A bit of a paradox, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, I would probably prefer. I would love to see the national team of Cyprus go out and play in a major tournament. Personally, I prefer that more than watching their clubs be in the Europa League last 16.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think that's maybe a topic of conversation for another time, though, I'm afraid. I've certainly got what I wanted out of this episode in terms of learning what the fan culture in Cyprus is like, why there's so many lost clubs, and, I hope our listeners have learned something as well. So, John, thank you very much for coming on to talk about APOP Kinyras and their story and the surrounding themes and, that are kind of linked to football in Cyprus, the reasons why clubs go defunct in terms of the finances and overspending and all of the other different themes that we've discussed. To our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in once again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If there's a topic that you want us to cover that's related to football history or heritage, then please do get in touch. It can be anything under that umbrella, whether it's identities, club identities, fan identities, ultras groups, community clubs, football culture, you name it. Find a way to get in touch with us and we'll see what we can do to get you on the podcast. You can reach us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. You can also check us out on our website where all of our fantastic written content goes up from our wonderful contributors, so please have a look at that. But for now, John, say goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.